The first thing Marco Bellini felt was pain, a sharp, pulsing ache that radiated from the back of his skull and spread like wildfire through his temples. His eyelids were heavy, as if weighted down by lead, and when he finally managed to force them open, the world came into focus in fragments. White ceiling, crystal chandelier, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking a cityscape he didn't recognize. His mouth was dry, his limbs felt foreign, and his mind was an empty void where memories should have been. He tried to sit up, but his body protested with a dull heaviness. A bandage was wrapped tightly around his head, the fabric rough against his skin. Panic clawed at his chest, a primal animal fear that came from not knowing where he was, not knowing who he was, not knowing why everything felt like a dream he couldn't wake from. Then he saw her. A woman sat in a velvet armchair beside the bed, her posture elegant yet tense, like a sculpture carved from marble and brought to life. She was beautiful in a classical way, dark hair pulled back into a neat bun, olive skin that glowed in the morning light, and eyes that were deep brown, almost black, holding secrets he couldn't begin to guess. She wore a simple cream blouse and dark slacks, nothing extravagant, yet she carried herself with a quiet authority that filled the room. When she noticed he was awake, her expression shifted, relief flooding her features, though something in her eyes remained guarded. She rose gracefully and moved to his side, her movements careful, calculated. She reached for his hand, her fingers cool and soft against his calloused palm. She spoke his name, Marco, and told him she was Elena, his wife. Her voice was soothing, like honey poured over gravel, but there was a tremor beneath it, a barely perceptible shake that suggested she was walking a tightrope. She explained that there had been an accident, a violent one, and that he'd been unconscious for 3 days. The doctor said the trauma had caused temporary amnesia, but that his memories would return in time. She promised him that everything would be all right, that she would help him remember. Marco searched her face for something, anything that might spark recognition, but there was nothing. She was a stranger wearing the title of wife, and yet, when she touched him, something deep within him responded. Not memory, but instinct. A sense of familiarity that his body recognized even though his mind did not. The penthouse was vast and luxurious, filled with expensive furniture, original artwork, and the kind of silence that only money could buy. Outside the windows, New York City stretched out like a living organism, chaotic, indifferent, vast. Marco spent those first hours wandering through the space, touching objects as if they might hold clues. A leather-bound book on the coffee table, a crystal decanter filled with amber liquid, a photograph on the mantelpiece showing him and Elena on what appeared to be a beach at sunset, both smiling, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Elena followed him at a distance, always watching, always ready to answer his questions. She told him he was a businessman, an importer of fine wines and art, someone who had built an empire through hard work and careful connections. She spoke of dinners with important people, trips to Italy, a life that sounded both glamorous and exhausting. But Marco noticed the way she hesitated before answering certain questions, the way her eyes would dart away when he asked about his family, his past, the scar on his shoulder that looked more like a bullet wound than anything from a legitimate business. That night, as he lay in the enormous bed beside her, Marco stared at the ceiling and tried to force his mind to remember. But there was only darkness, a void where his life should have been. Elena slept beside him, or pretended to, her breathing steady and calm. He turned his head to look at her, studying the curve of her cheek, the way her lashes cast shadows on her skin. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something else, something he couldn't name. A tension that hung between them like an invisible thread, pulled taut and ready to snap. As the days passed, Marco began to notice things. The way the staff in the building avoided his eyes when he passed. The way people on the street seemed to part for him, their gazes a mixture of fear and respect. The way Elena's phone rang constantly, but she always stepped out of the room to answer it. He tried to access his own phone, but it was password protected, and when he asked Elena about it, she told him it was for his own protection, that there were people who might try to take advantage of his condition. One afternoon, a man arrived at the penthouse, a large, scarred individual with cold eyes and a suit that barely contained his bulk. Elena introduced him as Vincent, Marco's head of security. Vincent didn't smile, didn't offer pleasantries. He simply nodded, his gaze assessing, as if he were measuring Marco for a coffin. Vincent spoke briefly with Elena in the hallway, their voices low and urgent, and though Marco couldn't hear the words, he saw the way Vincent's jaw tightened, the way Elena's hands clenched at her sides. After Vincent left, Marco confronted Elena. He asked her why a wine importer needed a head of security who looked like he'd killed men with his bare hands. Elena's expression remained calm, but her answer was too practiced, too smooth. She told him that in their world, wealth attracted danger, and that Vincent was simply insurance against those who might wish them harm. But Marco didn't believe her, not entirely, because deep in his gut, in that place where instinct lived, he knew there was more. He knew that the life she was describing was a carefully constructed fiction, and that the truth, whatever it was buried somewhere in the darkness of his missing memories. That night, he dreamed. Not memories, but sensations, the sound of gunfire, the smell of blood and gunpowder, the weight of a weapon in his hand. He woke with a start, his heart pounding, sweat soaking the sheets. Elena was already awake, watching him from her side of the bed. She asked if he was all right, her voice soft with concern, but her eyes, those dark, secretive eyes, held something else. Fear, perhaps, or guilt. Marco realized then that he was a prisoner in a gilded cage, trapped in a life he couldn't remember, with a woman he couldn't trust. And the only way out was to uncover the truth, piece by piece, no matter how dangerous that truth might be. Marco Bellini was not a man who accepted uncertainty. Even without his memories, something primal within him demanded answers, control, understanding. The penthouse had become both sanctuary and prison, a beautiful cage where every surface gleamed with wealth, but every shadow held secrets. Elena moved through their shared space like a ghost, always present, yet somehow distant, her tenderness genuine enough to confuse him, her lies skilled enough to almost convince him. He began his investigation carefully, methodically, like a man reconstructing a life from scattered pieces of a shattered mirror. When Elena left for what she called appointments, meetings with friends, visits to her mother, errands that always seemed urgent, Marco would search. He moved through drawers and closets, looking for anything that might illuminate the darkness in his mind. He found expensive suits tailored perfectly to his frame, watches that cost more than most people's homes, and a collection of Italian shoes that spoke of a man who valued appearance and precision. But it was what he didn't find that troubled him most. There were no photographs of family gatherings, no birthday cards or sentimental letters, no evidence of a life lived beyond the walls of this luxurious prison. The penthouse was immaculate, sterile even, as if it had been staged rather than lived in. The only personal items were recent: the beach photograph on the mantel, a few books with barely creased spines, a wedding ring on his finger that felt foreign despite Elena's insistence that they'd been married for 3 years. One afternoon, while Elena was out, Marco discovered that the building's concierge knew him in a way that made the elderly man's hands shake when Marco approached the desk. The concierge, a grey-haired man named Robert, wouldn't meet his eyes directly. When Marco asked casual questions about how long he'd lived in the building, Robert's answers were clipped, nervous. He mentioned that Mr. Bellini had always been a generous tipper, that his associates were always professional, that there had never been any trouble. The last word spoken with emphasis, as if to reassure himself rather than Marco. Associates. The word hung in the air like smoke. Marco began to pay attention to the people around him. Vincent wasn't the only one who came to the penthouse. There were others, men in expensive suits, with eyes that had seen violence, women who looked like they could kill in heels and designer dresses. They never stayed long, and Elena always made sure Marco was either resting or occupied in another room when they arrived. But he saw them coming and going, caught glimpses of conversations cut short when he entered a room, noticed the way they all deferred to Elena with a respect that went beyond courtesy. His body remembered things his mind did not. When he picked up a knife to cut fruit in the kitchen, his hands moved with practiced efficiency, the blade becoming an extension of his arm. When a door slammed unexpectedly, he found himself in a defensive stance. Before conscious thought could catch up, his weight balanced, his muscles coiled. And when he caught his reflection in the mirror, really looked at himself, he saw scars, small ones, faded with time, but there, a thin line along his jaw, a puckered mark on his collarbone. The larger one on his shoulder that Elena insisted was from a boating accident years ago. Marco began to test Elena, asking questions designed to trip her up. He would mention places he supposedly should remember and watch her reaction when he got details wrong. Sometimes she corrected him smoothly, her explanations plausible. Other times he saw hesitation, a fraction of a second where she had to think, to calculate her response. She was good, better than good, but no one was perfect. One evening, they attended what Elena called a charity gala. She insisted it would be good for him, that seeing familiar faces might trigger memories. She dressed him in a tuxedo that fit like it had been made for him, because it had been, and they arrived at a Manhattan ballroom filled with New York's elite. Marco watched Elena work the room, her smile gracious, her conversation effortless. People approached them with careful respect, offering well wishes for his recovery while their eyes assessed him, measuring whether the man who had returned was the same man who had left. An older man with silver hair and a face like carved granite approached them. He embraced Marco carefully, as one might embrace someone fragile, and spoke of their long friendship, their shared history. But when Marco asked him to remind him how they'd met, the man's smile faltered. He glanced at Elena, who intervened smoothly, explaining that it had been at a business conference in Rome many years ago. The man nodded along, but Marco saw the confusion in his eyes, the unspoken question about why such a story would need to be fabricated. Later that night, a woman approached him at the bar, stunning, with platinum hair and lips painted the color of blood. She touched his arm with familiar intimacy and asked when he would come see her again. Elena appeared before Marco could respond, her hand sliding possessively around his waist as she steered him away. The platinum-haired woman watched them leave, her expression a mixture of anger and something that looked like betrayal. When they returned home, Marco confronted Elena about the woman. Who was she? What did she mean? Elena's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of something raw and painful crossing her features before the mask returned. She told him the woman was no one, a complication from before, someone who didn't understand boundaries. But the explanation felt hollow, and Marco added it to his growing list of inconsistencies. The breakthrough came by accident. Marco was in the study, a room Elena rarely used, when he knocked over a lamp. It shattered on the hardwood floor, and when he bent to clean up the pieces, he noticed something odd about the wall where the lamp had stood. A slight discoloration, a seam barely visible in the wallpaper. He pressed against it, and a panel swung open to reveal a small safe built into the wall. His heart pounded as he stared at the safe's digital keypad. He had no idea what the combination might be, but his fingers moved of their own accord, muscle memory guiding them. 6 digits. The safe clicked open. Inside, he found documents. Contracts written in language that suggested anything but legitimate business. Photographs of men who looked dangerous, their faces hard, their eyes empty. And then, buried beneath it all, a wedding photograph, but not the one on the mantel. This one showed Elena in a white dress, radiant and smiling, standing beside a dark-haired man who wasn't Marco. The man's arm was around her waist, his expression possessive. On the back of the photo, written in elegant script, Elena and Dante Marchesi, June 2023. Marco's world tilted. He stared at the photograph, his mind racing through possibilities, each more troubling than the last. Dante Marchesi. The name meant nothing to him, but the date, less than 2 years ago, meant everything. If she'd been married in 2023, and they'd supposedly been married for 3 years, then one of these marriages was a lie. He heard Elena's key in the lock, the sound of the front door opening. Quickly, he closed the safe, pocketed the photograph, and moved away from the wall. When Elena entered the study moments later, he was standing by the window, his expression neutral, though his pulse thundered in his ears. She asked if everything was all right. He told her he'd been looking at the city, thinking about all the memories locked somewhere in his head. She came to stand beside him, her reflection in the window beautiful and sad. She told him she understood how frustrating it must be, how frightening. She promised that she would help him through this, that they would rebuild what had been lost together. And as Marco looked at her reflection, this woman who claimed to be his wife, who touched him with practiced tenderness, who lied with the ease of someone who'd been doing it her entire life, he realized he was standing next to an enemy he was beginning to care for, which made her the most dangerous person in his world. That night, lying beside her in the darkness, Marco made a decision. He would continue to play the role of the confused, recovering husband, but he would also continue to search, to question, to piece together the truth. Because somewhere in the gaps between Elena's lies and his missing memories, there was a story of betrayal, of violence, of two people caught in a web neither of them had expected, and he would uncover it, no matter the cost. The photograph became Marco's obsession, a tangible piece of evidence in a world that felt increasingly constructed. He kept it hidden, checking on it compulsively, tucked in the pocket of a jacket Elena never touched, between the pages of a book on economics he pretended to read. Dante Marchesi. The name echoed in his mind like a warning bell, though he still had no context for who the man was or what he'd meant to Elena. More importantly, what he meant to the life Marco couldn't remember. He began his research carefully. The penthouse had a laptop in the study, and when Elena was occupied, which, he noticed, was increasingly often, Marco would search for information. He typed Dante Marchesi's name into search engines and found fragments, mentions in society pages, references to import-export businesses, a few photographs from charity events. Dante had been handsome in a classical Italian way, with dark eyes and the kind of confident smile that suggested a man comfortable with power. But it was the articles from 8 months ago that made Marco's blood run cold. Dante Marchesi had been found dead in his Greenwich Village townhouse, the victim of what police called a home invasion gone wrong. The case remained unsolved. No suspects, no arrests, just another wealthy man dead in a city that produced tragedy with assembly line efficiency. Marco sat back in the leather chair, his mind working through the implications. Elena's husband, her real husband, was dead, and somehow Marco was now in his place, with no memory of how he'd gotten there or what had happened to put him in this position. The coincidence was too perfect, too convenient, which meant it wasn't a coincidence at all. He began watching Elena with new eyes, studying her like she was a puzzle he needed to solve. She was careful, always careful, but even the most skilled actors had tells. She received phone calls at odd hours, always stepping into the bedroom or bathroom to take them. Her phone was never left unattended, always close, always guarded. And sometimes, when she thought he wasn't looking, her expression would shift, the mask would slip, and he would see something underneath. Not cruelty, which would have been easier to understand, but sadness, a deep, genuine grief that seemed at odds with the role she was playing. Vincent became Marco's unwitting source of information. The head of security visited frequently, and Marco noticed that the man's deference wasn't to him, but to Elena. Vincent took orders from her, reported to her, looked to her for guidance. This wasn't the dynamic of a wife deferring to her powerful husband. This was something else entirely. One afternoon, Marco pretended to sleep on the living room sofa while Vincent and Elena spoke in the adjacent kitchen. Their voices were low, but the penthouse's open floor plan carried sound better than they realized. He heard fragments, enough to paint a troubling picture. Vincent mentioned someone named Luca, said he was getting impatient, that the situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Elena's response was sharp, commanding. She reminded Vincent that she was in control, that Luca would wait until she decided it was time, that Marco was still valuable. Valuable. The word struck him like a physical blow. He was valuable to them, which meant he was being kept for a reason. But what reason? What could a man with no memory possibly offer? The answer came to him slowly, pieces falling into place like a puzzle he'd been staring at all along, without seeing the picture. If Marco was who Vincent and the others treated him like, if the fear in people's eyes, the deference, the carefully maintained distance all pointed to what he suspected, then he wasn't valuable for what he knew. He was valuable for what he represented. Power, influence, control over something these people wanted. Marco decided to take a risk. The next time Vincent visited, Marco confronted him directly. He stood in the man's path, refused to move, and asked him plainly, who was he? Not the fiction Elena had been feeding him about wine, importing and art dealing, but the truth. Who was Marco Bellini really? Vincent's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or a grudging respect. The security chief glanced toward Elena, who had appeared in the doorway, her face pale. Marco kept his attention on Vincent, pressed harder. He told Vincent he knew there was more to the story, that he'd found inconsistencies, that he deserved to know who he'd been before the accident. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Then Elena spoke, her voice quiet but firm. She told Vincent to leave. The big man hesitated, then nodded and walked toward the door. But before he left, he turned back to Marco and spoke a single sentence that changed everything. He told Marco to ask Elena about the Bellini family, about what happened in Brooklyn 3 months ago, and about why half the crime families in New York were waiting to see if Marco Bellini would ever truly come back. After Vincent left, the penthouse felt smaller, the air thicker. Elena stood across the room from Marco, and for the first time since he'd woken in that bed, she looked genuinely afraid. Not of him, though perhaps that should have been her fear, but of something larger, of consequences, of a truth that was finally, inevitably coming to light. Marco gave her one chance. He told her to explain, to tell him everything, to stop the lies that had been suffocating them both. And slowly, carefully, Elena began to speak. She told him that Marco Bellini was not a wine importer. He was one of the most powerful mafia bosses in New York, the head of a criminal empire built on his family's legacy of violence and ruthless efficiency. The Bellini family controlled territories from Brooklyn to the Bronx, managed operations that moved millions of dollars through the city's underworld, and maintained power through a combination of strategic alliances and brutal enforcement. 3 months ago, there had been an attempt on Marco's life, a coordinated attack by a rival family attempting to seize control of Bellini territory. Marco had survived, but barely. A bullet had grazed his skull, causing the head trauma that stole his memories. He'd been unconscious for days, hovering between life and death, while his organization scrambled to maintain order and hide his vulnerability from their enemies. And Elena? Elena had been Dante Marchese's wife. Dante, who had been one of Marco's lieutenants, a trusted member of his inner circle, until Dante had betrayed him, providing information to the rival family that had allowed them to plan the ambush. In the chaos following the assassination attempt, Dante had been eliminated, killed by Marco's own men as punishment for his betrayal. Elena's voice broke as she described what happened next. With Dante dead and Marco incapacitated, someone in the organization, she wouldn't say who, though Marco suspected it was this Luca that Vincent had mentioned, came up with a plan. They would use Elena, the widow of a traitor, to maintain the fiction of Marco's recovery. They would place her beside him, have her play the role of devoted wife, use her presence to buy time while they consolidated power and prepared for the war that would inevitably come when the truth of Marco's condition became known. But the plan had a flaw, one that no one had anticipated. As Elena spent day after day with Marco, as she watched him struggle to understand a world that made no sense, as she guided him through the performance of being a man he couldn't remember being, something changed. She began to see him not as the monster she'd been told he was, not as the man who had ordered her husband's death, but as someone vulnerable, lost, and strangely gentle in his confusion. She fell in love with him, with this version of him, the man without the weight of violence and power, without the callousness that came from decades of making impossible choices in an impossible world. Marco listened to all of this, his mind reeling. Every word she spoke felt both impossible and inevitable, like watching a film he'd somehow known the ending to all along. The scars on his body suddenly made sense, the fear in people's eyes, the way Vincent and the others moved around him like he was a loaded weapon that might go off at any moment. He was a monster. And Elena, the woman who had been lying to him since the moment he opened his eyes, was the only person in his world who had actually tried to protect him from that truth. Marco asked the question that mattered most. He asked Elena what was supposed to happen next, what the endgame was, and her answer froze the blood in his veins. She told him that Luca, the man who had orchestrated this entire charade, was growing impatient. The rival families were circling, sensing weakness. The organization needed its leader back, needed Marco Bellini to remember who he was and take control again. But if he didn't, if his memories never returned, then Luca would have to eliminate him, not out of malice, but out of necessity. Because a mafia boss who couldn't remember his own empire was worse than no boss at all. He was a vulnerability, a weakness that enemies could exploit. Marco had perhaps weeks, maybe only days, before Luca decided that the risk was too great, that it was time to cut their losses and remove Marco from the equation. And when that happened, Elena would likely be eliminated too, a loose end, a witness to a failed plan, the widow of a traitor who had already proven herself unreliable. They stood in the penthouse, the city lights glittering beyond the windows, and Marco realized they were both prisoners now, prisoners of a life he couldn't remember and she couldn't escape, prisoners of choices made by men who saw them as nothing more than pieces on a chessboard, expendable and easily replaced. But Marco Bellini, even without his memories, was not a man who accepted being a victim. And as he looked at Elena, at this woman who had lied to him out of survival and then complicated everything by developing actual feelings, he made a decision. He would remember, or he would create a new version of himself strong enough to survive what was coming. Because whatever else was true, whatever else he had been or might become, he was not going to let Luca or anyone else decide when his story ended. And neither would Elena. The revelation of Marco's true identity didn't restore his memories, but it changed everything. He moved through the penthouse differently now, no longer a confused patient trying to piece together a lost life, but a man preparing for war. The truth had stripped away the comfortable fiction Elena had built, leaving them both exposed and vulnerable in ways that went far beyond physical danger. Elena watched the transformation with a mixture of awe and terror. Even without his memories, Marco's instincts were returning. He studied the documents she provided, organizational charts, territory maps, financial records of the Bellini Empire. He asked questions that revealed a tactical mind still functioning despite the blank spaces in his history. And when Vincent next visited, Marco didn't defer or question. He commanded, and Vincent, after a brief hesitation and a glance at Elena, obeyed. But time was running out. Luca's patience had limits, and those limits were approaching fast. Vincent reported that the rival families were testing boundaries, pushing into Bellini territory, sensing the power vacuum. Street-level soldiers were getting nervous, wondering if their boss would ever truly return. And Luca himself had begun making decisions without consultation, positioning himself as the de facto leader while Marco remained in recovery. Marco knew what that meant. Luca wasn't waiting for Marco to return. He was building his own power base, preparing to take over permanently. And the easiest way to make that transition smooth would be to eliminate the former boss and claim it was a tragic complication from his injuries. One evening, as Marco stood in his study reviewing the maps of his territory, Elena entered. She'd been quiet since her confession, moving through their space like a ghost haunted by her own choices. But now she looked different, determined, her chin lifted, her eyes fierce. She told Marco there was another option, one she'd been considering. They could run, take what money they could access, disappear before Luca made his move. She had contacts from Dante's time, people who could help them create new identities, start over somewhere far from New York's underworld. They could be free from Luca, from the violence, from the expectations of a life Marco couldn't remember anyway. Marco listened to her proposal, seeing the hope in her eyes, the desperate desire for something resembling a normal life. And he understood the appeal. He could walk away from Marco Bellini, from a legacy of violence he had no emotional connection to. He could build something new with Elena, two people escaping their pasts and creating a future unburdened by the weight of who they'd been. But even as he considered it, Marco knew it wouldn't work. Not because he couldn't imagine that life, but because of what running would mean. The Bellini Empire, built over generations by his family, would collapse. The territory would be divided among rivals, leading to wars that would kill hundreds, soldiers, civilians, families caught in the crossfire. The people who had served his family loyally would be hunted down, eliminated as loose ends by whoever seized power. And Elena, despite her offer to run, would never truly be safe. In their world, betrayal had consequences that stretched across continents and years. Luca would hunt them not out of revenge, but out of necessity, because letting them live would make him look weak, and weakness in that world was fatal. Marco told Elena no, they wouldn't run. Instead, they would do something far more dangerous. They would force the confrontation with Luca before he was ready, seize control of the situation before it consumed them. Elena argued that it was suicide, that Marco, without his memories, couldn't possibly stand against a man who had been consolidating power for months. But Marco countered with something she hadn't considered: his amnesia, his vulnerability. These weren't weaknesses. They were weapons, because everyone underestimated him now. Everyone thought he was broken, dependent, controllable, which meant they wouldn't see him coming until it was too late. They spent the next 3 days preparing. Vincent, convinced that Marco was truly taking charge again, provided intelligence on Luca's movements and the loyalty of various crew members. Elena used her own connections, people who had known Dante, who felt guilt over what happened to her, to gather information and create backdoor options. And Marco himself studied everything he could about his former life, not trying to remember, but rather to understand, to see the patterns, the strategies, the psychology of the man he had been. The confrontation was set for a Friday night at one of the Bellini family's legitimate businesses, a restaurant in Brooklyn that served as neutral ground for important meetings. Luca would be there with his closest supporters, and Marco requested a meeting to discuss the transition of power. Luca, confident in his position and pleased that Marco seemed ready to step aside gracefully, agreed, immediately. The night was cold for late October, the kind of crisp autumn evening that made New York feel both beautiful and dangerous. Marco dressed carefully in one of his expensive suits, noting how the fabric felt comfortable now, how his body knew the weight of the weapon holstered at his back, even though his mind had no memory of ever carrying one. Elena insisted on coming with him, despite the danger. She'd been part of this from the beginning, she argued, and she wouldn't hide while Marco faced the consequences of their shared deception. Marco wanted to refuse, to keep her safe, but he saw the steel in her eyes and recognized that this wasn't a request. She would be there, whether he agreed or not. The restaurant was elegant, white tablecloths, candlelight, classical music playing softly. Most of the staff had been dismissed for the evening, leaving only a few trusted members of the organization. Luca sat at a table in the back, flanked by 3 men Marco didn't recognize, but whose body language screamed enforcer. Luca himself was younger than Marco had expected, mid-30s with sharp features and expensive clothes that spoke of someone trying hard to project power. Marco and Elena entered together, Vincent trailing behind them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as all eyes turned to them. Marco moved with confidence, his posture reflecting weeks of preparation and instinct that ran deeper than memory. He took the seat across from Luca, while Elena sat beside him, her hand resting briefly on his arm, a gesture of support that didn't go unnoticed. Luca's smile was pleasant, but his eyes were cold, calculating. He thanked Marco for coming, expressed his relief at seeing him up and about, then launched into what was clearly a prepared speech about the need for strong leadership, about how the organization had to move forward, about how Marco's injuries had created an unfortunate but undeniable reality. Marco let him talk. He watched Luca's body language, the way his supporters positioned themselves, the exits and angles of the room. And when Luca finally finished his carefully worded speech, which amounted to a polite demand that Marco step down and let Luca take over, Marco smiled. He thanked Luca for his honesty. He acknowledged that his injuries had created difficulties, that his amnesia had been a burden on everyone. Then he said something that made Luca's smile falter. Marco told him that he agreed. Marco Bellini, as he had been, the man who had built this empire through violence and fear, was gone. That version of him died when the bullet grazed his skull. And perhaps that was for the best, because that version of Marco Bellini had made mistakes, like trusting Dante Marchesi, who had betrayed him, like not seeing the ambition in Luca's eyes until it was almost too late. The room went very quiet. Luca's hand moved slightly, his enforcers shifting position. But Marco continued, his voice steady, authoritative in a way that had nothing to do with memory and everything to do with the fundamental force of his personality. He told them that the old Marco Bellini was dead, but a new one had been born. One who had spent months learning his empire from the outside, seeing its weaknesses and strengths with fresh eyes. One who understood that power maintained through fear alone was always vulnerable, always at risk of being overthrown by the next ambitious lieutenant. And then Marco made his move. He produced documents, financial records that Vincent had helped him secure, showing that Luca had been skimming from the organization's profits, building his own war chest in preparation for a takeover. He revealed that Luca had been in contact with one of the rival families, negotiating territory in exchange for their support when he made his move against Marco. Luca's face went pale, then red. He started to speak, to deny, but Marco cut him off. He told Luca that he had a choice. He could walk away now, leave New York, and live. Or he could fight, and Marco would ensure that everyone in their world knew what Luca had done, the betrayal, the theft, the cowardice of negotiating with enemies. The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Marco could see Luca calculating, weighing his options, looking at his enforcers to gauge their loyalty now that the truth was exposed. And Marco realized that this was it, the moment when everything would be decided, when his new life would either begin or end. Luca stood slowly, his hand moving toward his jacket. Vincent tensed, reaching for his own weapon. The enforcers moved, and Elena, sitting beside Marco, suddenly stood as well, her voice cutting through the tension. She spoke directly to Luca, her words deliberate and clear. She told him about the package she'd prepared, copies of all the evidence against him, ready to be distributed to every family in New York if anything happened to her or Marco. She told him about the people she'd contacted, Dante's old allies who owed her favors and would be very interested to know how Luca had been planning to divide up Bellini territory with outsiders. It was a bluff, at least partially. But it was delivered with such conviction, such absolute certainty, that Luca believed it. More importantly, his enforcers believed it. Because in their world, insurance policies and contingency plans were expected, respected even. Luca looked at Marco, then at Elena, then back at Marco. Whatever he saw in Marco's eyes, memory or not, Marco Bellini's fundamental nature remained, made him reconsider. Slowly, deliberately, he removed his hand from his jacket. He told Marco that perhaps he'd been hasty, that there were things they could discuss, arrangements that could be made. But Marco shook his head. He told Luca the offer was one time only. Walk away now, or face the consequences. The silence stretched. Then, with a bitter smile, Luca nodded. He told his men to stand down, adjusted his jacket, and walked toward the exit. At the door, he paused and looked back at Marco. He said that Marco might not remember who he used to be, but clearly he was still dangerous. Then he was gone, disappearing into the Brooklyn night. The tension in the room dissolved slowly, like ice melting. Vincent exhaled audibly, his hand moving away from his weapon. The remaining members of the organization looked at Marco with new eyes. Respect, certainly, but also something else. Relief, perhaps, because a leader who could outmaneuver Luca without firing a shot was someone worth following. Marco and Elena left the restaurant together, Vincent flanking them as they walked to the car. The night air was cold and clean, washing away the tension of the confrontation. As they drove back to Manhattan, Elena finally spoke, her voice quiet. She asked Marco what happened next. Now that Luca was gone, now that he'd asserted control, what would he do with the empire he'd reclaimed? Marco was quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights blur past the window. Then he told her that he didn't know. He couldn't be the man he'd been before. That person was truly gone, lost in the darkness where his memories should be. But he couldn't walk away either, not when so many people's lives depended on the stability his leadership provided. So he would do something different. He would be a new kind of leader, one who understood power but wasn't consumed by it. One who remembered, even if only intellectually, the cost of violence, the weight of lives destroyed. He would protect his people and his territory, but he would do it with the perspective of someone who had been forced to see the world anew. And Elena? He looked at her then. This woman who had entered his life as a lie, but had become something real, something precious. He asked her if she could stay, knowing the truth now, knowing what he was and what his world demanded. Elena's eyes shimmered with tears, but she smiled. She told him that she'd fallen in love with a man without a past, and that man was still here, still present in everything he did. The fact that he now carried the weight of Marco Bellini's empire didn't change that. If anything, it made her love him more, because he was trying to be better than the man he'd been, trying to find humanity in a world built on violence. Back at the penthouse, they stood together by the windows, looking out at New York spread beneath them like a living tapestry of light and shadow. Marco's reflection in the glass showed a man changed, no longer lost, no longer uncertain, but still not quite whole. He might never remember the details of his past life, the specific moments and decisions that had made him who he was. But perhaps that was a gift rather than a curse, because it meant he could choose who to become rather than being trapped by who he had been. Elena's hand found his, their fingers interlacing, two people bound by lies that had transformed into truth, by danger that had forged something stronger than either of them expected. They had survived betrayal, violence, and the weight of impossible choices. And now, standing together in the aftermath, they had the rarest of things in their dark world. They had a future. Not the one either of them had planned. Certainly not an easy one, but theirs nonetheless. Built on honesty hard-won, trust earned through fire, and a love that had somehow bloomed in the spaces between truth and deception. Marco turned from the window to look at Elena. Really look at her. The woman who had been assigned to deceive him, who had fallen for the man she'd discovered beneath the monster's reputation, who had stood beside him when loyalty would have been easier served by betrayal. He asked her the question that had haunted him since finding the photograph, since learning the truth about who they both were. If she had lied to him, controlled his reality, shaped his understanding of the world, why did this, what they had now, still feel real? Elena's answer was simple, devastating in its honesty. Because some things, she told him, transcend the lies we tell and the roles we play. Some connections form not because of the stories we construct, but despite them. She had lied about being his wife, but somewhere along the way, the lie had become a truth she wanted more than anything she'd ever wanted before. Marco pulled her close, and they stood together as the city breathed around them. That vast, indifferent organism that had witnessed countless stories of love and betrayal, power and redemption. They were just two more people in that endless narrative, but their story was theirs, forged in darkness and emerging into an uncertain light. Outside, New York continued its eternal rhythm. Inside the penthouse, two people who had every reason to be enemies chose instead to be allies, to be more than allies. The Mafia boss, who woke with no memory, had learned a truth that perhaps he'd never understood in his previous life. That power meant nothing without something worth protecting. That strength wasn't measured in fear, but in the courage to be vulnerable with someone who'd seen your darkest truths and chosen to stay anyway. And the woman beside him, who had entered his life wearing lies like armor, had discovered that sometimes the most honest thing you could do was admit to your deceptions and then choose to be better. They didn't know what the future held. The rival families would still be watching, testing, waiting for weakness. The organization would demand leadership, would test him constantly to see if the new Marco Bellini was as strong as the old one. And there would always be people like Luca, ambitious and hungry, ready to exploit any opening. But for this moment, in this space carved out of danger and uncertainty, they had each other, and in a world as dark as theirs, that was something worth fighting for. Marco Bellini had woken with no memory and found a woman claiming to be his wife. The claim had been false, but the woman, her strength, her complexity, her unexpected love, had been real. And sometimes, in the most unlikely circumstances, the truth hidden within a lie is more powerful than the deception that contains it. If you enjoyed this story of betrayal, redemption, and unexpected love, please subscribe to our channel for more emotionally gripping tales that explore the complexity of human nature. Hit the notification bell to never miss a story, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on Marco and Elena's journey. What would you have done in their position? Could you forgive the lies if the love that emerged was real? Join our community of story lovers, and let's continue exploring these powerful narratives together. Tentar novamente. Claude pode cometer erros. Confira sempre as respostas.